dudes and dudettes, what's going on with y'all? So, been on a little while, I know. My life cycle moves around a little bit, but I determined that I was going to do the sensible thing, which is take a little break, and then came back. And I did, and I'm back, so let's go. Anyway, to kick things off, I decided I was going to go ahead and review Critical Failures, which is a book I actually remember fairly fondly. The short version of describing this book is that essentially it is Ready Player One, but focused exclusively on D&D as opposed to a broad 80s mass appeal. And while I understand that that's a little bit more of a niche market in certain regards, the fact is that what I was saying about Ready Player One was the fact that it probably needed to focus a little bit more specifically on what it was doing instead of just saying everything in the 80s. So, let's go ahead and check it out. So we kick off our story with a group of people who are wanting to play D&D, or knock off D&D anyway, which they call CNC, Creatures and Caravans. It's the same thing. Anyway, they actually are struggling so much to find a DM that they take out an ad in the paper. I don't know how many of us read the paper in the first place anyway, but let's just assume that this actually does have a feasible way of working. My problem with this description of their DM, it bothers me a little bit because it's very stereotypically the guy wears an actual cape and he refuseth to talk in a way that beeth normal. I don't think so many of us are like that. You saw nothing! You saw nothing! And so as the characters are all setting up their characters for the game, we come across this interesting situation in which one of the new players, named Julian, ends up awarding his elf with the stature of a wizard because the elf has a high intelligence stat and thusly would be a good caster based on the rules in the book. And this is actually one of the biggest problems that happens in playing any sort of tabletop role-playing game. It's referred to as metagaming, which is whenever you use your character or give them information that the character wouldn't have even though you as the player do. It's actually something that's a really big problem, but it's interesting to see that it's depicted in this in a sort of way. The other thing that I thought was actually really interesting is because the player chooses to follow the rules of the rulebook, he's awarded extra experience points by their DM. Now, the reason that I find this so particularly funny is because it displays the first rule of all tabletop role-playing games that have a DM or a GM. Don't fuck with them, because they will fuck you back harder. I just thought it was really funny that it's something that's actually depicted in this, and it made me laugh. And so as our campaign kicks off, the players are all brought into this town of Algor, which immediately the entire table makes fun of for sounding too close to Al Gore. I have to admit, this actually does make me smile a little bit because I, as a DM, have been a victim of thoughtlessly naming towns words that sounded cool at the time, only to later realize that they actually have a real-life implication that's not gonna be funny very long. For example, I named an elven town Hillshire, not thinking anything of it. And I heard the phrase, "go meet," about 50 times during the course of that campaign. So, as the players continue on through this world, they encounter a caravan and end up stealing it, even though nobody knows how to drive said carriage. And I thought this is actually a little bit funny because this is absolutely a problem that players get into in diving headfirst when actually none of their characters know how to do the thing that they're doing, and they kind of end up screwing themselves. One thing I do think is odd is they mention the fact that you actually want to roll low on ability checks in the game, and while it's not a huge point, it throws me off because it's very much not a thing. Maybe it was in the older versions of D&D, or maybe this is just something the author is homebrewing. It's just a weirdly specific bit, and I'm not sure where that comes from. Again, it's something that wouldn't stick out to the average viewer, but as I'm assuming this attracts the tabletop playing nerd community, this seems like something that just comes very far left field. Like I said, maybe it was a thing in the older versions of the game, I don't honestly know. But yeah, based on the current version of the game, absolutely not true. So I just thought it was weird. Anyway, as they continue on, the players end up mocking the DM so much that he ends up getting very angry at them and sucking them into the game using a set of magical dice. It's kind of weird because this is the only explanation that I'm aware of. I'm about halfway through the second book now. As far as I know, we get no further exclamation ever than magical dice, which seems very lazy. I mean, I get that this realistically was, what if D&D was real? And they just worked backwards from there. But, yeah, no excuse for laziness. That's a naughty. So one thing the author actually does a fair job of describing is the disconcerting effects of suddenly being a different race. For example, two of the characters in the book end up playing a halfling and an elf respectively, both of which have extremely acute hearing. It throws them off and it disconcerts them for a little while, whereas I can actually see that being a very big issue. I mean, if one of your senses was suddenly enhanced, it just would throw you off. I mean, this is also one of the biggest problems I've ever seen if you suddenly had a spider sense for Spider-Man. I think it would really throw you off and disconcert you for a long period of time until you learn how to adjust to it. So, as the story continues, eventually the main character's sister and her boyfriend get sucked into the game. And it's actually really funny because the character's boyfriend gets made into a bard. And there's a lot of jokes to the fact that nobody likes bards, nobody ever wants to be a bard. And this actually made me laugh because in 3.5, which is what I played in high school, this was absolutely true. In fact, the bard was so underpowered that we often had homebrewed rules for how leveling up as a bard worked, because nobody ever wanted to be a bard. It's also really funny to me because in 5e, which is what I now play, the bard is very powerful. It actually is one of the better classes in the game to go into. So I think it's really funny how this flip-flopped, and I don't think they were directly related to each other in any way, just from different causations. I think it's really funny that this ended up being a completely, going from a totally accurate statement to a totally inaccurate statement. So anyway, one of the main characters ends up getting put in jail, which is a pretty standard thing to happen to a D&D party early on. Manages to escape, get himself out, and then something kind of weird takes a turn. See, the DM is still a character in the real world while they're all busy being sucked into the game, and he's presumably running the game from outside of it. And occasionally throughout the story he pops in using different things as a catalyst for his head. It makes more sense if you just choose not to think about it. Anyway, they end up tricking him into locking himself in a freezer, and then the DM dies. Understandably, he was not a good character at all, but presumably the game now continues with no DM, which is a really weird thing, because while there are modules and things that are kind of a base, the major factor of the game is that the DM needs to kind of be there, not just to balance the game out, but to really make anything happen. So, as I say, I'm a little ways into the second book now, and losing an antagonist, who the DM has been up to this point, is actually very critical to the story. It hurts it, I think. Because there isn't really an antagonist except they want to go home. There isn't a villain, so to speak. There are people that are doing bad things, but they feel more like mini-villains as opposed to an actual overall antagonist of the story, who no longer exists because he died at the end of the first book. And like I said, I'm part of the way through the second one, and I might continue with it, but honestly, it feels very soft now. And I think there are 7 of these things, so unless something else kicks in that really makes this thing take off, it definitely has been overstaying its welcome. But anyway, that's all I have to say for this. Personally, I would give this 7.5 out of 10. Strong first book, ending kind of goes weird, and it tapers off pretty quickly after that, but it's an interesting concept, and like I say, the author's writing actually isn't too bad, at least descriptively. Could use a little bit more work from story plot elements, but overall I definitely did enjoy the story. So let's go ahead and take a look at that bingo card. And we actually did hit bingo once. So, yeah, that's going to go ahead and be all for my return to doing Chris Reads. I don't know how frequently I'll be able to do these. I will try to do them with more frequency, but like I said, just based on my own state, we'll see kind of how that goes. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any other suggestions for something else you want me to read, watch, review, go ahead and leave a comment down below and let me know. Until next time, drink plenty of water, tell your parents that you love them, and stroke your mustache at night.